The year is 186 BCE, and in the heart of ancient Rome, a wedding unfolds exactly as it should, flawless in appearance and heavy with expectation. The marble hall glows with torchlight. Musicians play familiar hymns, and respected families watch with approving smiles as a 16-year-old bride performs the role Rome has trained her for since childhood. She moves with measured grace, speaks when prompted, lowers her eyes at the right moments, and accepts the blessings offered to her as if they are gifts rather than obligations. Her father stands among the guests, proud and silent, knowing this marriage secures alliances, wealth, and honor. The dowry is generous, the omens favorable, the gods publicly satisfied. To everyone watching, this is the end of the story. Yet when the final cups of wine are drained and the guests begin to leave, Rome's true ceremony begins. The groom does not take the bride home. Instead, older women step forward quiet, experienced, their faces unreadable, and gently guide the girl away from the hall. No one explains why. No one asks. This moment is understood without words. As she is led through a side passage, away from laughter and music, the bride turns once toward her father. There is no rebellion in her eyes, only confusion and an unspoken question. He does not answer it. He cannot. Not because he is cruel, but because he knows what comes next and understands that to resist would mean defying religion, law, and tradition all at once. Rome has taught him that some duties must be endured in silence. The corridor grows colder as they descend stone steps beneath the city into spaces the public never sees. Above them, Rome celebrates marriage as joy and order. Below, the city keeps its secrets. This hidden descent is not mentioned in speeches or poems, yet it is essential, for without it, the marriage is incomplete. Roman law does not treat marriage as a private promise, but as a sacred transaction, one that requires approval, not only from families, but from the gods themselves. And the gods, Rome believes, demand proof. What follows is never called violence in surviving texts. It is called purification, a necessary offering before a woman may pass from her father as authority into her husband as hand. Priests oversee it. Laws protect it. Silence surrounds it. The bride is told only that this is her duty, that endurance brings honor, that fear is a weakness she must conquer alone. Long after the torches above have burned out, she will emerge changed, carrying a burden she is forbidden to name. Rome will move on, secure in its order, while this moment vanishes into the shadows. Centuries later, historians will struggle to describe what happened here, finding only fragments, hints, and censored words. But tonight, beneath the streets of Rome, the ritual continues exactly as it always has, unseen, unquestioned, and terrifyingly real. To understand why this hidden ritual existed, one must look beyond emotion and into the machinery of Roman law, where marriage was never merely a union of two people, but a transfer of power carefully regulated by religion. In Rome, a woman did not simply marry. She passed from one authority to another. As a daughter, she belonged to her father. As a wife, she would belong to her husband. This transfer was called manus, the hand, a word that revealed everything about how Rome understood marriage. A woman was moved, like property, from one hand to the next. Yet ancient legal sources reveal something unsettling. This transfer could not happen automatically. Before a woman could fully become a wife, she had to be made acceptable to the gods. Legal language returns again and again to the same term purificatio. Purification was not symbolic. It was a ritual requirement, enforced not by husbands, but by religious authorities who claimed to act on behalf of divine will. Rome believed its stability depended on strict obedience to sacred law. Crops failed, armies fell, and cities burned when the gods were offended. Marriage, tied to inheritance and lineage, was therefore treated as a matter of state survival. The bride's body became part of that equation. Cults dedicated to fertility and household protection, most notably those associated with female deities, operated behind walls of secrecy. Their rights were legally protected from inquiry, even by magistrates. What happened within their chambers was defined as sacred knowledge, not subject to explanation. Fathers were taught that allowing these rites was not cruelty, but responsibility. Refusal would place an entire family under suspicion of impiety, a charge that could destroy social standing and invite legal punishment. This is why no objections appear in the records. The system was designed so that consent was assumed and resistance was unthinkable. The bride herself had no legal voice in the matter. Roman law defined her as transitioning, neither fully under her father's protection, nor yet under her husband's authority. In that moment between hands, she existed in a legal void where priests, not family, held control. Later writers would struggle to describe this without naming it directly. They used phrases like the god's portion or the necessary offering, careful not to provoke accusations of sacrilege. What survives is indirect but consistent. Marriage required a debt to be paid, and the payment was personal. This is why the groom was excluded from the final rite. The ritual did not belong to him. It belonged to the gods and those who served them. By framing the act as religious duty, Rome transformed fear into obligation and suffering into virtue. The law did not protect the bride from the ritual. It protected the ritual from the bride. And once it was complete, she emerged legally purified, ready to be claimed as a wife. The brilliance of the system lay in its language. Nothing was described as harm. Everything was described as order. And as long as order was preserved, Rome believed the gods would remain silent. After the law released her from her father's hand, the bride was not taken forward into her new life, but downward, into the parts of Rome that daylight never touched. Ancient writers avoided naming these places, yet archaeology has revealed their existence with unsettling clarity. Beneath major temples, beneath hills crowded with shrines and altars, there were chambers sealed away from public sight. They were not tombs and not storehouses. They were built deliberately, with narrow stairways, thick doors, and stone platforms shaped with a purpose that is impossible to ignore. When the bride was led from the wedding feast, she was escorted not by her husband, but by women who had already endured the same descent. Their role was not to comfort, but to instruct, to ensure obedience, to prevent panic. The groom was excluded because this ritual did not belong to him. Above ground, marriage celebrated order and continuity. Below ground, Rome confronted what it believed was necessary to secure that order. Torches cast uneven light against stone walls as the procession moved deeper, the sounds of the city fading until only footsteps and breath remained. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the scent of damp stone and smoke. In these chambers, witnesses were controlled, exits sealed, and secrecy enforced by design. Archaeological excavations beneath former temple sites have uncovered floors cut with shallow channels, doors that locked from the outside, and walls marked with inscriptions that were never meant to be read aloud. Names were carved carefully, almost reverently, often accompanied by dates that align with known wedding celebrations. These markings suggest remembrance, not honor, as if someone feared that without stone the event itself would vanish. What happened inside these chambers was framed as sacred purification, yet surviving literary fragments suggest fear and coercion rather than reverence. A censored comedic play from the early Republic contains a single surviving line: "The gods take their portion first." The context is lost, but the implication is not. Another fragment, preserved only because it was quoted by a later critic, asks what the bride receives in return. The answer is chilling in its simplicity: acceptance. No joy, no blessing, only permission to exist within the law. The physical evidence aligns with these hints. The platforms are positioned beneath openings where light barely reaches. The doors are designed to isolate sound. Everything about the architecture suggests control and inevitability. For the bride, This descent marked the moment when fear became duty. She had been taught obedience her entire life, taught that endurance was virtue and silence was strength. Now those lessons were tested in a space where resistance carried no meaning. Above ground, the city slept peacefully, unaware or unwilling to know. Below, the ritual continued, unrecorded in official histories, yet etched into stone by those who understood that memory was dangerous, but forgetting was worse. When the bride finally emerged, she would return upward purified in the eyes of the law, carrying no visible mark of what had been demanded. Rome would call the marriage complete. The city would move on, and the chambers would wait unchanged for the next descent. What made this ritual endure was not secrecy alone, but the way Rome transformed terror into theology. The priests who presided over these ceremonies never described themselves as perpetrators. They were guardians of balance, interpreters of divine will, men entrusted with maintaining harmony between the human world and forces believed to be dangerous if neglected. In their language, nothing improper occurred. The rite was framed as necessitous, an unavoidable requirement demanded by tradition and sanctioned by centuries of religious authority. The gods, Rome believed, were not gentle beings. They demanded proof of obedience, proof that laws were followed even when they caused suffering. Marriage, bound to fertility, inheritance, and the future of families, was considered too important to risk divine displeasure. And so the burden fell on the bride. Ancient philosophical writings hint at discomfort with this logic, though rarely openly. One surviving passage describes sacred rites that test endurance rather than faith, suggesting that pain itself was seen as evidence of devotion. The priests claimed that purification removed dangerous spiritual residue, that the bride must be emptied of her former identity before she could safely enter a new household. This language stripped her of personhood and reduced her to a vessel to be prepared. The more she endured, the more complete the transformation was believed to be. What is striking is how carefully the system avoided accountability. The ritual was defined as divine exchange, meaning responsibility shifted upward. Any harm was attributed to the gods' will, not human action. This allowed priests to operate without fear of accusation and allowed fathers and husbands to distance themselves emotionally. They told themselves that the gods demanded this, and Rome had survived by listening to the gods. In this way, belief became armor. Surviving fragments from poets and moral critics suggest that not everyone was convinced. Some wrote of rites that consume innocence while pretending to protect it. Others warned that religion, when unexamined, could become a shelter for cruelty. Yet these voices were marginal, preserved only by chance. Official culture reinforced the opposite message. Endurance brought honor, silence brought respect, and questioning sacred acts brought ruin. For the bride, this meant her suffering was not only expected, but morally reframed. Fear became shameful. Pain became invisible. Survival itself was treated as proof that the ritual was justified. When she emerged, the priests declared her purified, acceptable, ready. No one asked what the gods had taken because the answer was too dangerous to acknowledge. The brilliance of the system lay in how completely it absorbed dissent. To object was to challenge religion. To question was to invite accusations of impiety. And so the ritual persisted, protected not by walls alone, but by belief itself. Rome did not need chains or guards in every case. It needed only faith, law, and the quiet agreement of those who told themselves that this was how the world worked. What ultimately protected this ritual was not darkness beneath the temples, but the law above them. Rome did not merely discourage women from speaking about sacred rites. It criminalized their testimony. Certain ceremonies were classified as mysteria, acts considered too holy to be described, too dangerous to expose. To reveal their contents was framed not as truth-telling, but as impiety, an offense against the gods themselves. Legal statutes made this explicit. A woman who disclosed what occurred during protected rites risked exile, confiscation of property, or death. In effect, the victims were transformed into criminals if they spoke. This is why the historical record feels fractured and evasive. Ancient historians do not describe the ritual directly, because doing so would have placed them outside the bounds of acceptable discourse. Instead, they relied on euphemism, implication, and silence. The system ensured that suffering left no official trace, yet silence does not erase memory. It only forces it to change form. Archaeology reveals what law tried to suppress. In several underground chambers, names appear carved into stone, sometimes accompanied by symbols, sometimes by dates. These inscriptions are careful, deliberate, and personal. They do not celebrate triumph or piety. They resemble records left by those who feared that if words could not survive, stone might. The act of carving a name in a forbidden space was itself an act of quiet resistance, a way to say, "This happened," without breaking the law. Visual evidence tells a similar story. In a sealed room excavated near Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered a fresco hidden behind a deliberately bricked wall. At first glance, it depicted a conventional wedding scene: bride, groom, guests, order restored. But behind the central figures, partially obscured, another image emerged. A woman was shown being led downward by robed attendants, her body angled away from the celebration, her face turned back toward the light she was leaving behind. The emotional detail in her expression was striking, far more precise than that of the figures meant to be seen. The artist had invested care where Rome demanded none. This was not decoration. It was testimony disguised as art. The choice to hide the fresco suggests fear of discovery, but also determination to preserve truth in a form that could survive censorship. These silent records explain why modern historians encounter gaps instead of narratives. The absence of description is not evidence of innocence. It is evidence of enforcement. Rome did not forget these rituals by accident. It trained its people to look away, to accept that some knowledge was forbidden. Yet across centuries, through stone, pigment, and fragmented lines of censored text, the past continues to speak, not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. The silence that Rome imposed has endured, but it has never been complete. And it is in these quiet traces that the outline of what truly happened begins to emerge. By the late Republic and into the imperial era, something began to change. Rome did not publicly renounce the ritual, nor did it issue decrees condemning it. Instead, it did something far more effective. It allowed the practice to dissolve into ambiguity. Legal language softened. References became abstract. Priestly authority was reorganized. What had once been described as necessity was quietly reframed as tradition, then as symbolism, and finally as something no longer discussed at all. This was not moral awakening. It was strategic forgetting. As Rome expanded and absorbed new cultures, it began to reshape the image it projected to the world. The empire wanted to be seen as lawful, rational, and civilized. Practices that revealed how power truly operated, especially those involving controlled suffering and enforced silence, became inconvenient. They threatened the narrative Rome told about itself. And so the ritual was not abolished, it was buried. Temples were rebuilt, chambers were sealed, texts were edited, copied selectively, or allowed to decay. What remained were fragments that seemed too strange, too incomplete to challenge the official story. Later generations encountered these gaps and assumed they meant exaggeration or myth. But erasure leaves a distinct signature. It creates inconsistencies, evasions, and sudden absences where explanation should exist. Modern historians recognize this pattern. When a practice disappears without denunciation, it often means it was too foundational to confront openly. The ritual revealed an uncomfortable truth, that Rome's order depended not only on law and discipline, but on controlled vulnerability. It showed how religion could be used to sanctify harm, and how legal systems could be designed to protect power rather than people. By allowing the memory to fade, Rome protected its legacy. Yet the past resists silence. Archaeology continues to uncover sealed rooms, altered inscriptions, and images never meant to survive. Each discovery tightens the outline of what Rome tried to erase. This is why the ritual matters now. Not because it was unique to one civilization, but because it exposes a recurring pattern in human history. When suffering is reframed as duty, when silence is enforced by law, and when belief is used to excuse cruelty, societies do not need monsters to commit atrocities. They need only systems that reward obedience and punish truth. Rome mastered that system, then hid it when it no longer served its image. The bride who descended beneath the city did not leave behind a testimony, but she left behind a warning. It is written in stone, in censored lines, in the careful distance ancient writers kept from naming what they knew. The ritual ended, but the logic that sustained it did not. It reappears wherever power claims necessity and demands silence in return. Remembering this is uncomfortable. That is precisely why Rome tried to make sure we wouldn't.